Նյու Ջերսիի Սուրբ Ղևոնդաց Սենթ Լեոն հայկական եկեղեցու հանդիսությունների սրահում տեղի ունեցավ Marian Mesrobian MacCurdyի Secret Justice գրքի ներկայացումը։ Գրքի հիմքում ընկած է հեղինակի մեծ հոր Ահարոն Սաչակլյանի փաստագրություններն ու նամակագրությունները կապված հայկական վրեժառուներ Armenian Nemesis կազմակերպության հետ։
At St. Leon Armenian Church took place a memorable evening with writer Marian Mesrobian MacCurdy, who came to discuss her latest published book, Sacred Justice, The Voices and Legacy of Armenian Operation Nemesis. The conversation was led by founder and director of Armenian Radio Hour, Professor Vartan Abdo. Marian Mesrobian MacCurdy is a retired professor and chair of Department of Writing at Ithaca College, who is currently visiting professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. The evening began with remarks by Mr. Abdo, who introduced the author and spoke about the book.
There is a lot to be said about this book. Let me just say that it really deals with a very secret operation where Armenians had to do something after the genocide. You know, here we were punched, killed, massacred, deported, uprooted. We know the story. And then suddenly in 1921, March 15th, the Ides of March 1921, Tekeyan comes to Talat in the streets of Berlin, calls his name, Talat turns around, bang, 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 shoots Talat. Of course, we feel, we take a deep breath, but the list was much longer than just one person, or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 we know. And the list here of 100 names are in the book. So we know Tekeyan. Everybody knows Tekeyan. After 301 AD and 451 Ararat, we go to a little bit deeper into Tekeyan. And Tekeyan was taken to court and was found not guilty. How can a person who killed another person in broad daylight in the streets of Berlin be acquitted? This is impossible. But we know the story. The question here in this book is who was behind the scenes? Who was organizing these? There were 3 people, and that's the last thing I'm going to say. The 3 people who will be mentioned today, the pictures are here, are Armen Garo, who was the ambassador of Armenia in 1918 in Washington, D.C., and who had a role to play in Bank Ottoman. Marian, you can correct me later on. There was another gentleman by the name of Shahan Natali. Some people will go like so, but we really don't know enough about Shahan Natali. We've heard the name. He was a character, major player, and last but not least, recently discovered, 25 years after the death of her grandpa, Marian's, documents were discovered in the attic of their home. And based on these documents, especially based on the fact that she was able, as a writer, as a professor, to put it together, we have this book.
Sacred Justice is a cross-genre book that uses narrative, memoir, unpublished letters and photographs to tell a story of a group of Armenian men who organized Operation Nemesis, a covert operation created to assassinate the Turkish architects of Armenian Genocide. Sacred Justice, based on large collection of previously unpublished letters, found in an upstairs study of the author's grandfather, Aaron Sachaklian, one of the leaders of the Operation Nemesis.
The letters were actually stashed in an upstairs bedroom, the bedroom that I slept in as a small child. I lived with my grandparents till I was 6 years old. And those letters were right next to my head at night when I went to sleep. We didn't know about them at all until 1990 when my grandmother died. At that point, we had to tear apart the house because we were selling it, and we found the letters. And that was one of those moments when you look and you say, okay, this is too big, I can't swallow it all right now. I'm going to have to put it away and look at it another time. So that's what my mother did. She took the letters, took them out of my grandmother's house, and put them in her basement, in a cardboard box in her basement. Luckily, thank the Lord, my mother looked at them, made enough notation so that I would know that these letters were important, that I had to pay attention to them. And she told me they were there, and she told me what they were. So after my mother passed away, I went down to the basement. They had been flooded twice, 2 floods in the basement. So I yanked them out of the basement, brought them upstairs on the kitchen table, and laid them out on the kitchen table for the sun to dry them. I peeled the pages apart one by one and let them dry there. They had not seen the sun in 90 years.
The letters, hidden for nearly a century, showed the strategies, personalities, plan, and dedication of Soghomon Tehlerian, who killed Taylat Pasha, chief organizer of the Armenian Genocide, Aaron Sachaklian as the logistics and finance officer, Armen Karo, the center of Operation Nemesis, Shahan Natali, the agent on a group in Europe, and others involved with Nemesis. Additionally, Marian Mesrobian MacCurdy read excerpts from her book.
My grandfather lived to 84, the last few years in mental and visual darkness, his eyesight failing, his prodigious brain's neurons deadened from a series of strokes. Thinking me his wife as a young woman, he called me Eliza, took my hand in his, stroked it, and held it to his cheek. The third time he left the house to be brought back by the police, confused and shaking, my grandmother decided she could not, would not become his warden, and he was sent to Marcy State Hospital, where he died 3 days later. We were told of pneumonia, the old man's blessing. But this diagnosis did not mention the large quantities of barbiturates given to calm and likely kill this confused and frightened old man. No one in our family knew until close to 25 years after his death that my grandfather was the bursar and logistical leader of the covert operation known as Operation Nemesis to assassinate the architects of the Armenian Genocide.
Another chapter in the book worth noting is Armenian Revolutionary Federation's central involvement in Operation Nemesis. Marian Mesrobian spoke about the structure of ARF at the time and also financial support the operation received from numerous Armenian organizations to carry on the assassinations.
So the Bureau was the small sort of inner sanctum, and you had to be elected to be on the Bureau. Then there were central committees, and those central committees existed wherever there were large Armenian communities. So the Central Committee of Boston happened to be the one that was chosen to do Nemesis. My guess is because they could raise the money, because they're, you know, they were in America, right? And they were all of North America, right? So it wasn't just, you know, New England or something like that. It was, they were the Central Committee for all of North America. There was also a Caucasus Central Committee, and they had taken on some of the other assassinations. So they were sort of given the free hand, in other words. They were told, okay, central committees, you know, we're going to not get involved in this. You guys can go do it, right? And tell us about it, but we're not going to do it. So what happened was there was $26,000, almost $27,000, sitting in a bank. And I saw this because I found the accounts in my grandfather's files. I'm looking at this thing. This is the Nemesis account. And in 1927, there was 27 to almost close to that left in that account. Can you imagine how much money that would be for then? So I'm thinking to myself, you know, there must have been some strong pressure not to spend that money on Nemesis. And there was also then a fight between, not a fight, but an argument between Shahan, who wanted to continue. He wanted to continue and continue and continue and continue, probably beyond what would be reasonable. And the others, of course, you have to understand now, by then, Armen Garo had died. And so Sebu had been chosen to take over for him. And so, you know, there wasn't the will to move forward. They had kind of run out of steam almost.
In an informative and engaging conversation, Vartan Abdo and Marian Mesrobian touched on numerous subjects. This included conversation about the life of first genocide survivor Armenians who immigrated to US, the details and personalities involved in Operation Nemesis, and the story of author's grandfather getting involved with Operation Nemesis.
He left Turkey in 1896. He left at the age of 16. And he left during a period when the Turks they had just decided they were going to go after the Armenians again. And he narrowly escaped death. His uncle bribed the Turks to get him out of the country. And that's the only reason that he survived. He went back after the 1909 Constitution was approved, thinking that it was safe, and of course it wasn't, because right after that the Adana massacre happened. But he wanted to go back and see his family. He hadn't seen them in 14 years. So he did, and at the time when he went back, he had already met Simon Zavarian, who was one of the instigators, if you could call it that. He was a founding member of the ARF. He also had met, on his way out of the country when he first left, Portugalian, who was also a founder of one of the Armenian political parties that became the Ramgavad Party. And when those two men met him, they said, "Do not forget who you are. Do not forget you are Armenian. Don't forget your language. Don't leave us behind when you go to the United States. And he didn't. So when he went back to Armenia, he went back just at the moment the Dorchol was exploding. So he was able to smuggle guns in, and those guns actually became a part of the resistance a few years later at Musadag. And we know this because there was a deadhide there that was in charge of those people. And my grandmother met somebody who then had spoken to the deadhide, and the deadhide said these guns came from Sachak. So he was involved in all of this, I think, probably throughout his life, and just we didn't know.
The evening continued with engaging Q&A with the audience. At the conclusion of the event, the author signed copies of the books. Marian Mesrobian MacCurdy's incredible story has been either hidden by necessity of silence or ignored because the first and even second generation of Armenian genocide survivors choose not to speak about. It is the story of the leaders of Operation Nemesis who took it upon themselves to seek justice for their murdered families, friends, and compatriots. This book is not only the story of individuals who attempted to seek justice for the victims of genocide, but also the effect this effort had on them and on their families. Ultimately, this volume reveals how the narratives of resistance and trauma can play out in the next generation and how this resistance can promote resilience.
One of the reasons that I did this book was because the narrative that most Armenians carry within them, it's a true narrative, is that we were victimized. We were almost destroyed, and we came back from virtually almost the dead. There's another narrative that walks along with that, and that's a narrative of resistance. And when we have a narrative of resistance as well, we have agency, we have autonomy, we have the right to be here. And that's an important story that I think needed to be told. We have a right to be here, and we carry within us both of those stories. So that's the reason that I thought it was an important story to tell. As I read these stories from these letters, I realized that we have three generations represented here. We have the first generation, those who survived. And many of those people were so traumatized that they couldn't tell their story. There was nobody to tell their story to. Who are they going to tell it to? Another survivor? They certainly weren't going to tell their children. They didn't want to affect their children with that story. So they kept it quiet. The next generation, the second generation, their job was to create cultural buildings, create an Armenian culture that we could be proud of, that we could live within, to anchor us into this new world that we are trying to build together. And again, who are they going to tell their story to? The third generation has now a platform to work on, and that platform allows them then to move forward. And here's where you have political protest. Here's where you have other narratives coming to the surface. And I think that's part of the reason why Nemesis has, in some ways, found its audience, because we know about the victimhood. Even if we didn't talk about it, we feel it, we know it. What we don't know is how we responded in other ways, how we were able to resist, how we were able to find our own justice. That's a very important story for us to carry to our next generation.